Hello lovely people. In case you're new around here who haven't picked up on the gay vibes or me frequently talking about my wife, yes I am looking at you people who comment, I was subscribed but I've just realised you're a homo so I'm unsubscribing. Feel free to subscribe to make up for them. I'm queer! Oh well, yes, queer has been used as a slur in the past and still is today. Because of that, there's a lot of discussion about whether it's okay to say queer. So everyone can say queer now? It's complicated. The language we use to talk about gender and sexuality are constantly evolving, and the term queer has an important history not only as a slur, but as a word that's been reclaimed by the LGBTQ+ community. Oh, yeah, right, no, sure, I get that. Today, the term queer is commonly used as an umbrella term for LGBTQ+ people, especially by people and organisations who want to be inclusive of as many identities as possible under that umbrella. There are a number of celebrities who describe themselves as queer, including Elliot Page, Janelle Monáe, Miley Cyrus, and Sarah Ramirez. Well, like many LGBTQ+ people, they find it empowering to reclaim queer, and it's pretty amazing that we have so many public figures loudly and proudly talking about their queerness when it used to be a word that being associated with meant they would immediately lose their careers. But not all LGBTQ+ people are comfortable with the word queer, especially when it's used by people who aren't in the LGBTQ+ community themselves. So, is it okay to say queer? And when did queer begin to mean, well, queer? The origins of the word queer. Well, queer has been used in English since around the 16th century, and originally it meant strange or peculiar. One of the challenges of finding and talking about LGBTQ+ people in history is that the language we use today to talk about gender and sexuality simply didn't exist. You can't find a man writing about his bisexuality in the late 1800s because the term bisexuality just hadn't been invented yet. Oh, and there's a small matter that the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 had made all homosexual acts illegal, regardless of whether or not they were witnessed. So you probably don't want to be making down a note of each illegal dalliance unless you are writing in heavily coded language. And Anne Lister, I am looking at you. In that time, a letter expressing terms of affection between two men was all the evidence required to prosecute, so coded language was a necessity. Thus, it's hard to know exactly what language LGBTQ+ people were using or how they were using it. We have to rely on official records like court transcripts that largely weren't being written by LGBTQ+ people themselves. The writings of queer people, items like diaries and letters, were often destroyed either by queer people themselves or loved ones, to keep that person or their family safe or just to destroy evidence of queerness within the family. This means that the first citation of the word queer to mean not heterosexual in the Oxford English Dictionary comes from the trial of absolute icon Oscar Wilde in 1894. And as the Marquis's letter was about his disgust for Wilde's relationship with his son, it's hard to see that he intended the term to be complimentary. Who actually uses the word queer to describe himself today? Well, queer can be a useful shorthand for identities that aren't heterosexual, heteroromantic. It's widely understood, even outside the LGBTQ+ community, which can be helpful if you want to avoid having to answer 100 questions about something that, frankly, is no one else's business. So what type of LGBTQ are you? The gay type or the queer type? No, the gender type. Oh, both types? Just queer. Not that it's any of your business. Someone who uses queer might be a non-binary lesbian, or an asexual trans woman, or a biromantic demisexual guy. And yes, those are all different sexualities. And yes, those are all different genders. Confused? Well, keep watching and I'll explain. Reclaiming queer. Queer became increasingly used to describe LGBTQ+ people throughout the 20th century. The concise New Partridge Dictionary of Slang, published in 1982, states that the adjective queer began to be used to mean homosexual about 1914, mostly in the United States. It notes that the term was derogatory from the outside, but not from within. The 1965 printing of Webster's New Word Dictionary College Edition lists queer as slang for homosexual. Not offensive slang, just slang. So, queer was used as a slur, a derogatory word for an LGBTQ+ people throughout the 20th century. However, like many other slurs used to describe marginalized communities, queer has also been reclaimed by many of the LGBTQ+ community. Now, reclaiming a slur refers to the process of taking back a word used to demean and dehumanize a marginalized group through its use by the group it was originally intended to degrade. Slut is another example of a reclaimed slur. Oh, I don't think you meant to say that. That's kind of the point. The collective push to reclaim queer came in the late 1980s during the AIDS epidemic. A notable group behind this were Queer Nation, who are an activist organisation that was founded in 1990 by members of ACT UP New York. If you'd like to know more about how incredibly impactful AIDS was to the queer community, you can watch my video on Freddie Mercury and the AIDS epidemic, which is Here, you can click the card in the top left corner or find the link in the description. So ACT UP is the AIDS coalition to unleash power, and Queer Nation was inspired by the group's direct action and wanted to expand their focus from just AIDS to other places where LGBTQ+ people were being attacked. Queer Nation focused on attention-grabbing action to show that LGBTQ+ people had a right to take up space, and their ethos is kind of neatly summed up by the group's rallying cry of "We're here, we're queer, get used to it." One form of direct action Queer Nation employed were kiss-ins in shopping malls and straight bars. Kissing my wife in public is a form of activism? Sign me up. Isn't pushing your sexuality onto other people a bit gauche? Shouldn't we all just be respectful? Gosh, I wonder if we have that same energy for straight PDAs. In the abstract of Reclaiming Queer, Activist and Academic Rhetorics of Resistance by Dr. Erin J. Rand, an assistant professor of communication and rhetorical studies at Syracuse University, Rand says that confronted with the alarming violence of homophobia of the AIDS crisis, LGBT communities often responded with angry, militant forms of activism designed not merely to promote acceptance or tolerance, but to forge identity and strength from victimization and assert loudly and forcefully their rights to safety and humanity. Now, it can be incredibly powerful to reclaim words that have been used to hold you down, and through using them, take the power away from the people who have used them to hurt you. Queer becomes much less of an effective insult if you're trying to use it to offend someone who likes it to describe themselves. I personally used to love the look on the faces of kids who tried to taunt me in school for being openly gay by calling me gay. Are you a lesbian? Yes. Oh. A Dazed article by journalist Jake Hall entitled "Tracing the History of the Word Queer" states that the early 90s can be pinpointed as the decade in which queer was radically reclaimed. The former insult was worn as a badge of honour. Not only did it become a definitive symbol of anarchy and rebellion, but it became the ultimate linguistic FU to homophobia. We're here, we're queer, we will not live in fear. As we move into the 21st century, the word queer slowly started to be seen not only as a pejorative, but as a positive word that LGBTQ+ people use to describe themselves. One of the first mainstream uses of queer was in the TV show Queer as Folk, which started airing in 1999. Written by television legend Russell T Davies, the Channel 4 show relayed the lives and experiences of 3 gay men in Manchester's gay village. The show's title comes from the English saying, "There's nowt so queer as folk," which actually means there's nothing as strange as people, which is very true. We're all very weird. Over in the US, Queer Eye for the Straight Guy started airing in 2003, and the spin-off Queer Eye for the Straight Girl had one series in 2005, but we don't talk about the spin-off. An Out magazine article from earlier this year said that the original Queer Eye proved that hetero guys had no reason to feel threatened if they hung out with gay men, and they may even be able to learn a thing or two from them. Wow. This was at a time when gay marriage wasn't even legal in the US or the UK. Isn't it interesting how queer culture has always been commodified by straight people when it can make money, even when they don't want to give us rights? Using queer today. Today, the word queer is often used as an umbrella term for LGBT people, encompassing all the aspects of identity that deviate from the cisgender, heterosexual, allosexual norm. And to anyone who is like, labels don't matter, I am not telling anyone that they need to label themselves, but labels can help people to find community and realise they're not alone and not broken. In an interview in Elle magazine in August, sex education actor and soon-to-be 15th Doctor Nkuti Gatwa spoke about his queerness and meeting with a Rwandan woman at Manchester Pride. He said, "I had never met another queer Rwandan person before. I thought I was the only one in the world." The queer carries much less stigma today, but that doesn't mean that everyone is comfortable with it. Queer is more often used by younger LGBTQ+ people, millennials and Gen Z, who notably were born after the LGBTQ+ community had begun the work to reclaim queer. Although older millennials are definitely going to remember being called queer in the bad way. What word is Gen Alpha going to use? Probably one you don't expect. It's totally understandable given all of the homophobia that many queer people have experienced, including violence that is directly linked to the term queer, that many people, most of them in the older generations, might not be interested in reclaiming it or comfortable with others doing so. When Huffington Post rebranded its Gay Voices column to Queer Voices in 2016 to make it more inclusive of the wider LGBTQ+ community, writer James Perron wrote an op-ed explaining that he doesn't find the word liberating, but traumatic. He said that once you were queer, you had no right to live, no right to happiness, and were a fair target for anyone needing to boost their own fragile masculinity. And Perron isn't alone in feeling that the term queer is too painful to be reclaimed. He writes that he feels he has worked since he came out to ensure that younger generations of LGBTQ+ people did not have the same experiences that he did, and now feels he and others who did have those experiences are being excluded because the word queer is too traumatic. Yeah, not surprisingly, these things can be really personal and really complex. It's also worth noting that lots of the words used to describe LGBTQ+ identities have been used as pejorative terms in the past. People in my generation grew up with the term gay being used constantly to describe anything that people didn't like. That's so gay. I really hope people have stopped using "that's so gay." It was the most boring insult in my secondary school. Well, maybe after your mum. My mum what, Nathan? My mum what? There has to be a second part for it to be a good comeback. The article Queer Identities in the 21st Century, Reclamation and Stigma, published in the journal Current Opinion in Psychology in February 2023, says that queer should be understood as both reclaimed and stigmatized. There are lots of people who really love the fluidity of queer and feel it gives them room to not have all the answers about their sexuality right now. And queer is being used to describe gender as well as sexuality. Singer Sam Smith came out as non-binary and genderqueer in an interview in 2019, but there are also people who use queer to describe their gender. The Gender Census is an annual community-based project to collect data on the language non-binary people use to describe their gender. It's specifically for people who don't fit into the categories of always, solely, or completely a woman/girl, or always, solely, or completely a man/boy. In 2023, there were more than 40,000 responses, and 54.8% of them said they use queer to describe their gender specifically. The Gender Census has been collecting data since 2015, but it's only since 2019 that queer has become one of the most common words that respondents use to describe their gender. Do people have to be queer now? No, it doesn't work for everybody. It's also important to note that there are trans and intersex people for whom the word queer doesn't work as an identifier, because even though they're part of the LGBTQ++ community, they're straight, or they see a lack of fluidity as an important part of their identity. If you are part of the LGBTQ+ community, you're allowed to use the word queer to describe yourself if you want to, but you absolutely do not need to use the word queer if you don't want to. Wait. Who can't say queer? Well, I mean, while we don't want to be prescriptive about language or to police the language that queer people want to use about themselves, if you're not part of the LGBTQ+ community yourself, you should be a little bit more careful with using queer. Don't panic, it is okay to say queer if it's the name of the program, like Queer Eye, or refer to your friend as queer if that's how they describe themselves. No one is going to cancel you for that. Though, it is important to remember that queer is an adjective, not a noun. So you can say a queer person, or Jessica is queer, but you shouldn't say Jessica is a queer, or a bunch of queers. What a lovely bunch of queers you have there. Though fun fact, it can be a verb. You can say queer to something, such as you're queering the nuclear family, or you're queering sex, or by interpreting it from a perspective or acting in a way that rejects cis-heteropatriarchal norms. Cis-heteropatriarchy refers to the idea that we live in a sexist society that assumes that everyone is straight and cisgender all of the time. The GLAAD Media Reference Guide, 11th edition, says that an adjective used by some people, particularly younger people, whose sexual orientation is not exclusively heterosexual, e.g. queer person, queer woman. It adds that, once considered a pejorative term, queer has been reclaimed by some LGBTQ+ people to describe themselves. However, it is not a universally accepted term, even within the LGBTQ+ community, so use caution when using it outside of describing the way someone self-identifies or in a direct quote. And to be honest, I feel like that is pretty good advice. Nowadays, a lot of people, and even media, talk about queer people or the queer community rather than LGBTQ+ people or the LGBTQ+ community. Folks within the LGBTQ+ community have mixed feelings about this, myself included. I do not want to upset people. Language is not neutral. It has the power to hurt. And when it is used by organizations or people outside of the community, it can feel too close to bigotry. It can feel too close to exclusion, to just forgetting that those people who have been injured exist. It's important that we don't erase the bigotry and bullying that LGBTQ plus people have experienced, where the word was spat at them as a slur. I don't think that there's a right answer or any community consensus here, in part because, shock horror, the LGBTQ plus community is not a monolith. As with all reclaimed slurs, the best advice, if you're wondering if you're allowed to use queer, is to pay attention to context. Try not to be an arse. It's worth taking a second and asking yourself, is queer is the right word to use in certain situations? Personally, I'll use the word queer to describe myself or a group of, queer friends. Even if not everyone in the group describes themselves specifically as queer, but everyone falls under the queer umbrella, unless there is someone there who definitely does not use that and would be offended by it. There are many generational differences within the LGBTQ+ community, but whether people are comfortable with reclaiming queer is a big one. For example, younger queer people might use the term to describe themselves and their friends and community. However, older LGBTQ+ people might not be able to separate the term from past trauma or homophobic experiences or violence. So queer might not be the most appropriate term for a group with a wide age range of LGBTQ+ folks. And of course, someone's age isn't a definitive guide to whether or not they use queer. So, don't describe someone as queer if you don't know if they use that word to describe themselves. And if someone tells you that being described like that makes them uncomfortable, you should stop and apologize and not do it again. Currently, there's a pushback against using the word queer from gender-critical feminists, i.e. people who definitely aren't feminist, but are very transphobic. Groups like LGB Alliance only support the use of terms lesbian and gay and bisexual, and those who use those terms to describe themselves, in part because queer is the gender-neutral term. Oh no. A Pink News article states that in a 2022 court hearing over the group's charitable status, why do they have that? What? Charitable status? Say what now? Co-founder Bev Jackson said the group was founded over their view that homosexuality was being redefined in a way that we found offensive. Yeah, well, I'm interested to see the group that springs from finding the way you use feminist offensive. So there is a big difference between folks within the LGBTQ+ community finding a word triggering, which is important to respect, and transphobic quote-unquote charity policing the language that LGBTQ+ people use for themselves in order to exclude trans and non-binary people. Again, I personally like the word queer, and not just because it's easier to say than LGBTQ++. Whilst I would never use it to describe someone who's uncomfortable with the term, it is a good word, and I would use it about myself. I am always aware of how harmful it can be. I think as a community of LGBTQ+ people, we don't always have that connection to our elders. We don't always have that connection to our history. It is difficult for us sometimes to come together. We're not raised within our culture necessarily. We don't have familial ties to each other in the way that people who are culturally French do. People who are culturally LGBTQ+ have to seek out elders. We have to actively seek out our history and actively learn it. It doesn't passively come to us at our grandparents' knees. That would be very cool though, if it did. If we just had ally grandparents who were I'm gonna tell you some straight stories today and then some gay ones too. Society has changed so quickly is not just a thing homophobic people say. It's also a thing that people who didn't fit into the straight, cisgendered, heteronormative world had to live through and still have to live through too in their communities. The term queer is still used as a slur today. Even if queer becomes fully reclaimed, another insult will just replace it. Unless we challenge the underlying homophobia that sees queerness as something that is bad, wrong. Honestly, sometimes it makes sense to me that LGBTQ+ activists in the 80s and 90s wanted to use in-your-face language that made people uncomfortable in order to get them to pay attention. Even in 2023, our rights are under attack around the world, with homophobic Don't Say Gay bills being passed in the US, and the government still not banning conversion therapy here in the UK. It's definitely not up to people outside of the LGBTQ+ community to decide when it's okay to say queer, especially when we're still fighting to prove that it is okay to be queer in the first place. Let me know your thoughts on the word queer in the comments section below. Do you use it? Do you hate it? Are you just blah? And to those of you who don't identify as LGBTQ+, are you now any clearer on when you should and shouldn't use the term? Oh, absolutely. And have you heard about the KF Club? This is the super cool, not so secret club for my channel members. And if you join, you get a shout out in your birthday month, access to exclusive behind the scenes videos. Your comments will also rise to the top of YouTube videos. I know, very exciting. And you get my little face after your name in the YouTube comments with a succession of beautiful crowns. And I love that because that means your comment replaces homophobic and transphobic comments that pop up on videos like this. It's like a persistent whack-a-mole. You gotta delete them fast. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Mwah. Bye-bye.